When I first read this article, the first thing I thought about was Animal Farm, where all animals are created equal, but some are more equal than others. So in this situation, though, we're talking about a certain type of animal. Are some humans more equal than others? Stephen?
Well, Dr. Carl R. Truman of Grove City College wants us to consider if children born via IVF and surrogacy are actually human. To which he says, yes, of course, but asserts that a society in general cannot say the same. Yes, this doctor of church history feels that a society that values means of procreation, such as in vitro fertilization and surrogacy, cannot value the resulting human. After all, IVF routinely sees multiple eggs fertilized during the procedure, and those extra eggs are discarded as waste. So, how can the one lucky fertilized egg be considered more than the others? How can a society that views a fertilized egg 9 months later as more than a commodity, which was bought and paid for? This story was published by the Christian Post on November 20th, 2024.
Thanks, Stephen. Now, I've got to say that obviously I don't come from the same position Truman does. I think IVF is an absolutely wonderful thing, and we should be encouraging people who want to be parents to be parents. But what do you think, Stephen, about this idea of him equating fertilized eggs with fully developed humans?
I think it's just like a new shade of lipstick on a very old, tired pig. The fact that now
you paint a wonderful picture, Stephen.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's the same old idea that as soon as that egg is fertilized, it must be a human being that is, equal in every other regard to a fully formed, fully developed human that is outside of the womb, which is just this common talking point that we keep on getting bludgeoned on the head over and over again. And it's discouraging that not only that people like Truman aren't content with controlling women's bodies and what goes on inside of them, but now they want to also control the means by which women can conceive or are forced to conceive. It's just this, it's the same circus that goes on and on and on, and it's so discouraging. It's so dishonest for someone, especially because he tries to pull this gotcha in the article where he says, should a human that's conceived this way be considered a human? Well, of course, but those other people over there, they can't consider that. They can't think that. It's so dishonest to be trying to take straw man the opposition and just paint their position for them, and especially when that isn't what people on this side of the issue would think at all. And it's deeply disturbing that this doctor of church history, who should know that the Christian view of life beginning at conception, which is only 150 years old for the vast majority of the church's history, this has not been their view, and yet now he needs to be a champion of it.
If there's anything the Catholic Church, or churches in general, I should say, in this situation, probably should avoid anything that has to do with kids. They should probably just keep silent. But especially when you start talking about things like ethics. Now, AJ, speaking of ethics, he brought up a lot of what he called ethical concerns about artificial conception. Could you give us a little more detail on how this relates to IVF and surrogacy?
This specific article was written by someone who's a Christian. Clearly, the website is a Christian website, so you can see the bias on it. Okay, and I think that I get the sentiment out of the core message of the article, but I found so many things that he says problematic that it was hard to focus on the main idea. So let's start with that so that it doesn't get lost. It seems to me that he was worried about the future ethical implications of artificial conception because he asked whether in the future parents may choose designer babies, so to speak, where they get to choose, the features that they want. And I'm quoting him here. He said that, what of the children who make it to term but do not meet the specifications of the parents who paid good money for a particular outcome? I think Stephen mentioned that earlier. He said, are those obligations defined by legal contracts such that perhaps they can simply return them to the manufacturer under warranty for a refund? I think I understand that concern, and I think it's valid, but it's one that we have already been looking at thoroughly as far as ethics of these procedures. So they have nothing to do with IVF or surrogacy and helping people who truly want to become parents, but they're facing infertility issues. He's just trying to mix ethics with his individual religious faith, and we don't need to do that.
I think that there'll be plenty of time between now and when that type of situation of designing your children is actually a scientific possibility. And there's going to be a lot of court cases in between. We've already had court cases regarding IVF. One in Alabama kind of set the apple cart a while back. So we see these things. So I think he's getting ahead of himself for dishonest reasons. And I wanted to switch over to you, Scott, because I wanted to touch on that. Do you feel like this is kind of a bait and switch technique where this is less about IVF and maybe more about something else he feels strongly about, like abortion?
Well, I wouldn't say it's not about IVF, but I think he's definitely trying to make a transition to, I think he's trying, it seemed like he was trying to set up an argument against abortion rights. And it starts right from the get-go. And I think this is very ironic. And that's a word I've been using a lot this week. It's ironic that he bemoans the fact of what he describes as, and this is a quote, "The child in the womb is treated not as a person, but as a thing, not as a subject, but as an object, not as intrinsically valuable, but as having value only as instrumental to some other end." But at the same time, the entire purpose of his post is to dehumanize pro-choice people or people that support this IVF option. And so while he's pointing out how these people are dehumanizing what he calls human beings, his very act of doing that is dehumanizing them. He wants to put them in the case of being the other. And it has to do with some of the language that he's using too, this bait and switch. The title talks about, quote, "children born by IVF," hinting that he's talking about living independent children. You know, this first grader, is that who we're talking about? Is this child, this first grader that was born via IVF, is this a real human being? But then he subtly and gradually shifts the attention over to the unborn, to a fetus, to an embryo, to a fertilized egg. In addition to that language that he used in the title, he specifically started out the article talking about parents of children that would come up to him after his talks and say, "Do you think my child is a human being?" And so he's putting this context of children in our mind, and then using the same terminology to talk about a fetus or an embryo or a zygote or whatever, anything post-conception, he's using that same terminology. So yes, it's a bait and switch. It's a subtle switch, but it's still there. And yes, I know that he considers an embryo to be a child. And so when he sees using that word appropriate in that circumstance, but it can't be a mistake that there's just so much that he's just clearly at the beginning of the article, he's talking about born children. And clearly later in the article, he's not talking about born children. So whether or not he still considers them to be children, he definitely was changing his tune throughout that article. And so I think that kind of leads into the emotional play. He's playing on our emotional love for children, for our children. We want to protect our children. We want to take care of our children. We want to stand up for our children. And he's trying to kind of push those feelings onto a fertilized egg. And it's really underhanded. I would think that if there was a good argument to be had there, he would use it, but he's not. So, what does that tell you?
I'm completely with you there, Scott. I think that it's clear that Truman has no idea about biology, or maybe as many Christians do, he gets his biology and human anatomy education straight from the Bible, because he is either making up definitions to words that match his opinion, or mixing up abortion, reproductive care, embryos, babies, surrogacy, and IVF all in the same bag. He claims that because modern humans now have all of these options, embryos have gone from being considered humans to being considered things or items or commodities. First of all, a clump of cells was never considered a full human being, at least not in the same sense that we consider one who is full term or already born, as you said. So that's why we call them embryos. And secondly, he's attempting to use, as you also mentioned, the appeal to emotion fallacy to defend his misinformation and his misinformed positions, rather. All it is just a bunch of anti-scientific bullshit that my brain is just having a hard time processing.
I think that both of you were very rude and noticing that switch because you weren't supposed to. You're supposed to be all weepy and involved in this story, and then he just slips a zygote in there, and before you know it, he's going to want you to pay child support on it and to put into its college fund, because that's really what he's doing. He's equating those two when, come on, that's not even close to what we're talking about. But Stephen, I wanted to bring you in on this. I know we've talked about the argument he made about IVF. I think you touched on the patriarchal aspect, but what does he have to say about couples who can't conceive in what his traditional hole in the sheet way is? What should they do? What does he think?
Like tied to your question, one thought that went through my head when reading this article is, and in its assumption, because I haven't gone for Thanksgiving dinner with this guy. I don't know anything about his family. What are the odds? What are the odds that this motherfucker has had any difficulty conceiving children? Does he have the slightest clue of what the pain that goes through a couple's relationship when they can't conceive, when that's something that is so desperate, and especially in their fucking Christian context where like this is the blessing of God, and that if you aren't able to conceive, then maybe there's something wrong with you, that you aren't able to receive God's blessing this way. What are the odds that he has a fucking clue about what it is that he's talking about? I don't know. I'm going to guess 0. I imagine that he has never had issues in this department. And so it seems like what would his stance be if he had to go through that trauma? If he had to go through that hell, would he still be so adamant about this? Or is this just based out of his own entitlement and his own privilege? Yeah, so he believes that people who struggle to conceive should not conceive outside of a miracle of God. And of course, the woman who is pregnant and doesn't want to be pregnant, she should remain pregnant at any cost. And it's just this entitled bullshit that we just hear constantly. I feel a little bit of cognitive dissonance when I say that I'm just tired of hearing, old white guys' opinions on abortion and women's bodies. And yet here I am as, a cis white guy saying, hey, shouldn't we stop giving so many fucks about what happens in women's bodies? And yet we have to talk out about this kind of stuff. Like, can't we just put women in the center of these conversations? Why is that so dangerous?
Yeah.
Well, number one, women should keep silent in the church. So when you have that type of mentality, of course, white men need to make these decisions so that these lesser qualified women know what to do. And I say that thoroughly tongue in cheek, but when they say that with their actions and activities, they're not being tongue in cheek at all, as you know. And unfortunately, that's why people like you, Stephen, and myself and Scott have to sit time and again, talk about issues that the truth is we shouldn't need to have an opinion on. Because as I talked to someone recently about, actually it was Ray, because we were talking about a story we did recently about how they felt abortion to be discussed at school in sexual education classes. And I'm like, well, really, it starts out like this. Abortion exists. Okay, end of story. Because you can't pretend it doesn't. But they want to pretend it doesn't. And as long as they do that, unfortunately, we're stuck doing this. And sorry about that. I wasn't mad at you, Scott. I'm just annoyed too because Stephen, because it's just as annoying to me. Now, Scott,
I said this on another show recently. I think it was actually on the nonprofits that I appreciate people like you guys, men, that speak up about these topics. And the reason why it shouldn't be this way, but the reason why is because the type of people that are coming out with these ideologies, like on the article, are generally white males. And they are not going to listen to women. So the fact that there are men that are speaking up about this means that they are more likely to listen to that. So I appreciate you guys.
Scott? About this comparison to IVF and commodity and the context,
Right.
we talked about Catholic charities and adoption agencies. What does that say about the idea of childbearing already being a commercial endeavor? Adoption is big business, so I don't know what he's talking about trying to pretend that
For sure.
it's not.
He kept, I mean, throughout the article, he uses words that are specifically intended to pull to mind this sterile environment, this hospital environment. He uses words like commodity. He uses words like transaction. He talks about the money exchanging hands and so forth. So I looked at this is from the Catholic Charities website. Quote, "What is the average cost of adopting a child? The cost depends on the type of adoption. There are several variables that contribute to the cost. Typically, a private domestic adoption is between $12,000 to $40,000. However, please do not be intimidated by the cost. There are several budgeting options to financing your adoption, such as employer benefits, adoption tax credit, grants, and special fundraising." That doesn't sound at all like a commercial financial exchange of money for goods and services at all, right? I mean,
No.
you couldn't get more. I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing that he's railing against. And it's not just Catholic charities either. According to HHS, there are more than 8,000 faith-based child placement agencies in the U.S. In addition to that, according to a Barna Group, 5% of practicing Christians in the United States have adopted children, which is more than twice the rate of all U.S. adults. And they put that forward as a kind of a brag. You know, our people adopt more children. That's a transaction of flesh for money. You pay somebody to have this child with you. And so, you know, it seems a little bit hypocritical. I guess that means Christians are really the main group of flesh peddlers in the U.S. And, you know, I'll check back on his blog next week, because I'm sure he's going to be talking about that next week. Not.
Well, Stephen, something you said earlier, I just wanted to touch on that. Yeah, I think that the odds of him having to deal with infertility and anywhere in his family are maybe slightly above zero, but statistically zero. This is somebody talking completely out of their ass. Now, do you find that Truman's language reflects a larger issue of dehumanization and moral authority? Do you see that, what he's trying to perpetrate here?
Why is he appealing? Yeah, using moral authority. Because it's the only rationale he can cling to. It's only through this kind of moralization of controlling how people get pregnant. It's like, what other tactic does he have other than to appeal to his own sense of morality, as if other people aren't entitled to a different perspective on the moral ethics of conceiving. Like, what an incredibly personal and private matter for him to try to stick his oar in.
I think it's definitely about control. Like you just said, you know, there was a quote in the article that I found really ironic. He said, "We live in a time where having children is increasingly regarded as dangerous." And I thought to myself, well, who the fuck exactly is making it dangerous for a woman to consider pregnancy dangerous? Like people like him, exactly people like him. Christian nationalists that want to micromanage women's bodies. They want to take away their reproductive care. They want to take away access to abortion. And at the same time, that takes away our bodily autonomy. They want to choose when, where, why, how, and with whom we get to have children. And then later he has the nerve to say that the absence of such desire to have children should surely be a cause for concern. I mean, like, people like him are a major cause of our lack of desire to have children, okay? And because they just want to micromanage every single step of it. And now he also wants to manage our desires. So if we don't have specific desires, suddenly we are seen as sus. like, watch out for that cat lady, you know. So it seems like they just ultimately want to dominate and control women. They want to go back to the biblical times where women were the property of their husbands.
Maybe we'd be more excited about having kids if there wasn't this great risk of them getting gunned down at school.
You know, you mentioned that, and also there's the fact that when we start talking about wealth disparity and the consolidation of wealth in the top percent, 1%, want to know why people don't want to have kids? Because one reason is they can't afford them. And so now we're talking about the ones that are trying to, and it seems odd that they're trying to create a stumbling block for this. Now, Scott, I was going to wrap things up, but I wanted to know if there's anything you wanted to cover before I do so.
Just to tag on to what AJ was talking about, there's a strong inverse correlation between the health of delivering mothers and the religiosity, both worldwide. If you count country by country, the more religious a country is, the lower the life expectancy and lower the health outcomes of pregnancy. And the lower the religiosity leads to safety, longer life, healthier lives for the mothers and for the children. And it's not just worldwide, country to country. It's also within the United States, state to state. And so there's plenty of evidence to show that they are, in fact, harming, the American community and the worldwide community. And so that I think we see why Stephen was saying that that's all they got. They have these emotional appeals, and, that's it. The man's a hammer, and he sees everything as a nail. And
yes, speaking of the harm that they're doing, we just had another case of a woman dying from being refused emergency care during a miscarriage here in Texas. It was a teenager just a few days ago, 18 years old. They are killing women, trying to save these clumps of cells based on 2,000-year-old sex manual, incredibly harmful teachings.
And then they dare call themselves pro-life.
Yes.
Get the fuck out of here.
That is
but only the life before it's born.
I suppose.
Oh yes, it's pro-forced birth, because when they tell me they're pro-life, I'm like, oh, support universal health care. You on your basic living wage? What about housing? How do you feel? No. I think women should have babies. Oh. Okay, you're not pro-life. You're something else. But if you're something else and you thought any of us were something else, believe me, we got a lot more for you. Just click down below for more nonprofits.